Hi, my name is Diana Chao. Welcome so much to our webinar today. I am very excited to be sharing this information with you guys, and I hope that you learn something that's useful, and feel free to ask me any questions you might have. So a little bit about me first and why I'm giving this webinar. Today's webinar is on mental health and specifically as it pertains to young people around the world. I will make the caveat that I am in the United States, so some of my tips or advice or whatever may seem more applicable from a Western perspective, but I will try my best to be mindful of a global perspective. And just remember that at the end of the day, I trust that you know your community and your needs best, and that you'll be able to integrate what you learn from this with your surroundings to make the most out of it. So my name is Diana Chao. I am a 20-year-old first-generation Chinese American immigrant. I am originally from Guizhou, China, living in Los Angeles, and I am in my dorm room at school at Princeton University, where I am a third-year undergraduate student studying geosciences, history, and the practice of diplomacy. So I founded Letters to Strangers when I was 14 years old. Letters to Strangers, or L2S, is the world's largest global youth for youth mental health nonprofit, impacting over 35,000 people with our chapters and partner sites network on 6 continents around the world in over a dozen countries. What I am really proud of is not only our mission, which is to destigmatize mental illness and increase access to affordable and quality treatment, but also that we are doing this not just through letter writing, but also through science-informed peer education and also grassroots policy-based advocacy. So these two pathways combined with our anonymous letter writing program form the ways that we seek to better youth mental health around the world. And the reason why I founded Letters to Strangers, I'll go into when I go through our webinar and our workshop, but that's enough about me for now. So let's just get started with the workshop. Let me see if I can share my screen. One sec. Let's see. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out logistics here. Aha. Here we go. Okay, I think this is working. Perfect. Okay, yeah, there we go. So, youth mental health learnings and strategies. Also, it's really wonderful that we're doing this right now because today is October 12th, and this is the week that is designated for mental health awareness. I think Mental Health Awareness Week should be every week, but it's nice that this is an extra emphasized day for mental health. So, before we get started, I want to ask y'all a question. True or false? 1 in 5 children ages 13 to 18 have or will have a serious mental illness. As you've probably guessed by the premise of this presentation, it's true. But that's not the only true thing about mental health that is useful for us to know. 50% of all lifetime cases of mental illness begin by age 14 and 75% by age 24. As you can see, even though we might think of mental illness as something that doesn't really affect us until we get older, it actually has its roots in a very young age. And that is why youth mental health is particularly important as we try to destigmatize and also seek better treatment for mental health. 37% of students aged 14 and up with a mental health condition drop out of school. This is the highest dropout rate of any disability group. Even with severe depression, 80% of American youths are left with no or insufficient treatment. And even though this statistic applies to the US, you can imagine that this statistic is also true and oftentimes even worse around the world, because mental health is just not something that's very much talked about or thought of as part of our well-being in a way that needs to be treated or that needs to see us go to a doctor for, etc. Suicide is the second leading cause of death in the US for ages 15 to 34. But in fact, suicide statistics show that around most countries around the world, Suicide is one of the leading causes of death for youth, regardless of where you are. The estimated cost of untreated mental illness in the US is $100 billion. This includes unemployment, unnecessary disability, substance abuse, etc. In fact, the total cost of mental illness that goes untreated in the world is more than the net worth of Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, the two richest people in the world, combined. 70 to 90% of individuals with mental illness saw improvement in their symptoms and quality of life after participating in some form of treatment. Now, this is very important because it's a big part of where hope can come from, right? Like we talk about how 50% of all lifetime cases begin by age 14. There's all these statistics that show that mental illness is something that hits a lot of people and can seem like a very, unfortunate and also just pessimistic thing, but it doesn't have to be. There definitely is a form of treatment that can work for you, and you might have to seek multiple types of treatment to get to that point. But that point is that there is hope, there is treatment that helps with healing, and there is a path for us to go forward from here. So, mental illness can affect anyone at any time, anywhere, at any age. This is not a moral dilemma. So that's why I'm here. Together, we must erase the stigma and increase access to quality, affordable care. So what is stigma? You probably heard of it before, but I think it's good for us to just define it to make sure that we're all on the same page. Stigma is a distinguishing mark of social grace. I jumped up too early. But yeah, it's a distinguishing mark of social disgrace. And what that really means is it's a force within society that prevents us from feeling like we can speak up, we can seek help, and we can find support. Sometimes stigma will be stronger in one aspect of your life than in another. For example, religious stigma might be more potent for you than cultural stigma, or maybe it's the other way around, or maybe it's stigma that gets complicated because you also have another identity that is stigmatized by your community, such as being LGBTQ+. So stigma is a very complicated thing, but the net idea is that it's something that prevents us from being the best self that we can be. So I mentioned a little bit about what Letters to Strangers is at the beginning of this webinar when I did my introduction. And there it is, a picture of me speaking about Letters to Strangers at TEDx. But you might be wondering why I am even giving this webinar, why I even care about mental health in the first place. So when I was 13 years old, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And after a series of years where I continuously struggled to stay alive, I turned to writing. You see, my family grew up penniless in America, in an immigrant family where my parents didn't speak English, where I went to a public school in the middle of nowhere. Like, for me, mental health is a sort of thing that feels both personal and incredibly distant at once, right? Like it's something that when I had it, when I was well, I felt it to the core of my being because I could treasure it. I knew what the alternative was. But at the same time, there were so many days when I felt like I would never reach a point where I would know what well-being means, what well-being is like. Because I didn't know how to navigate the healthcare system, because I was young, because of stigma, because of as many reasons as you can think of. It was writing that really began my healing process because it was something that I could easily do. And when I say writing, I don't just mean writing in a journal. I mean, I wrote letters. I wrote letters to no one, to someone, to everyone. It was to strangers, but also therefore to everyone at once. It wasn't to any one person, but it was to somebody in my head who I knew I wanted to show kindness for, to show empathy for. And it dawned on me that I'm putting all this emotional effort into trying to be kind to somebody else, yet I couldn't foster that same sort of kindness for myself. That didn't seem right. So through letter writing, I realized that I have a voice, that I should be kind to myself, that I deserve well-being, I have a voice to share my story with, and that my life and my story is well worth living and telling. In essence, writing is humanity distilled into ink. So that's why I started Letters to Strangers. It has a very personal spot for me, but in another aspect, I view it as me trying to live this second chance at life, right? So while we're on the topic of that, one thing I want to talk about is the idea of empathy. When I tell people about my mental health journey, they often ask questions like, well, what can I do to support? And we'll, get to the details of that later on. There's going to be a whole part where I talk about specific tips. But I think at the core of it, not just in terms of you supporting somebody else, but also you supporting yourself and also understanding yourself, is the concept of empathy. Now, you've probably heard of empathy and also sympathy. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between the two. So there's this really great talk by Brene Brown where empathy and sympathy are explained. But I'll just kind of reiterate what is said. So think of it like this. You are walking down the road and you see suddenly that there's a ditch, a hole in the road. And you look down and your friend is there, stuck. Now, sympathy is when you walk over and you lean down into the hole and you look at your friend and you say, dang, wow, really sucks that you're stuck in this hole. I'm sorry, man. I hope you get out soon. And then you keep on walking. Empathy is when you walk over to the hole, you look down and see your friend, and you go grab a ladder so that you can climb down the hole to where your friend is and say, hey, I know what it's like down here, and you are not alone, but let's get out of here together. So, empathy is feeling with people. In order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. But this is hard to do, right? Like, it's much easier for us to just say, hey, I hope you feel better soon, and then move on with our lives. Because we're all busy people, we have our own things to worry about. And frankly, sometimes it's like we don't want to put ourselves in that emotionally difficult place just to be empathetic with somebody. But my point is this: if your goal is to be empathetic, then you should approach it in a way that allows you to maximize your empathetic capabilities. And the way you do that is by trying to connect to that emotional point within yourself. Yes, of course, all of our differences mean that, we are not going to feel emotions the exact same way. We're not going to react to situations the same way. That's completely fair and normal. What I'm not saying is, hey, you have to go experience exactly what this person experienced to understand them. What I'm saying instead is to look in yourself, emotionally tune yourself to that frequency where you can connect with their emotional wavelength, right? What I mean is like, yes, I might not know what it's like to personally experience cancer, but I can think about times when I've been so scared because of a medical diagnosis. I've been fearful of my life, feeling like I don't know if I'm going to live to see another day, being scared of taking medications and their side effects, taking the essence of that fear, of that anxiousness, of that sadness, and using that to allow me to connect with this person on a very human level. So that is what I mean by empathy. And if nothing else, I hope that's what you remember from this webinar. Well, let's move on to a little bit more specific things about mental health. So what is mental health? Well, mental health includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. Contrary to popular belief, it's not just, being sad or being happy. There's a lot more to mental well-being than just like a singular emotional state. Mental health affects how we think, feel, and act. It can help us determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make choices. It's important at every stage of life. What is particularly critical to mental health is that its consequences oftentimes manifest in ways that we don't generally expect. I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but my key intention with showing you the definition of mental health here is to remind you that mental health affects you even if you don't necessarily think that it does. Because it's not just showing up through that one emotional state, like I mentioned earlier. It's also not just showing up through us wanting to sleep a lot more, but it could also show up through physical pain. It could show up through us lashing out at our friends. There's so much to mental health that is oftentimes forgotten when we talk about it in the general discourse. So it's from mentalhealth.gov, this definition. So what can affect our mental health? So there's a lot of different theories about what components form our mental health. But I will say that there's three key things. One is biological factors, one is sociocultural factors, and then there are environmental factors. Biological factors include, like genetics. So certain disorders like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, ADHD, etc., are more likely to be genetically passed down than others. The level of the neurotransmitter, which is like a chemical messenger in your brain, the level of a neurotransmitter called serotonin is lower in individuals who have depression. And so that's also something that affects like our actual like brain biology, brain chemistry, right? So the thing with this biological factor situation is that sometimes people misconstrue it as like, oh, I don't want to be with somebody who has a mental illness because then that means that I'm gonna have children who have mental illness. Or, oh, I shouldn't be with this person because that means that their family has these genes and that's just a bad family. These are very misguided conceptions, even though they're very popular conceptions, because at the end of the day, regardless of genetic disposition, epigenetics also play a role, sociocultural factors play a role, environmental factors play a role, and there are plenty of people who have family members who have a certain disorder who do not have that disorder themselves. So we shouldn't, judge people based on that factor alone. And when I say epigenetics, what I mean is the way that our environment can actually change the way that our DNA is coded. So, for example, like somebody who is a smoker, their epigenetics get changed so that their children are more likely to become smokers, even if technically within that person, like within the parent, their biology is still the same. It's a very confusing thing. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it. You can learn more about it online if you want. The point is that there's a lot of biological factors. And then there's sociocultural factors. So these are things like severe parental discord, death of a family or close friend, parents' mental illness and criminality, cultural repression, overcrowding, economic hardship, abuse and neglect, exposure to violence, etc., etc. And then environmental factors like a head injury, poor nutrition, exposure to toxins, these can all affect our mental health also. And this is actually especially potent in this day and age where climate change is becoming increasingly an issue, right? As you have more pollution around the world, this can have very real effects on the way that our brain functions. But I think one thing that a lot of people don't necessarily know about or talk about in terms of causes per se of mental illness are ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. So this was a study that basically asked participants questions about if they've experienced certain adverse childhood things. And based on how many experiences that you've had, they showed that there was an increase in risk of certain diseases and disorders. So these questions refer to things like emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, substance abuse or mental illness or incarceration in the family, separation or divorce of parents, emotional neglect, physical neglect, etc. And why ACEs matter is that almost 2/3 of study participants reported at least one ACE, and more than 1/5 reported 3 or more ACEs. That means that a lot of people experience adverse childhood experiences. And yes, some more than others, which can increase risks for disorders for those people. But the point being that this is something that matters to a lot more people than we think. and therefore we should look at and give more attention to than we currently do. For example, if you have an ACE score of 4 or more, your risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease increases by 2.5 times. Your risk of hepatitis by 2.5 times, depression by 4.5 times, and suicidality by 12 times. If you have an ACE score of 7 or more, your risk of lifetime your lifetime risk of lung cancer increases by 3 times, and your risk of coronary heart disease increases by 3.5 times. Now you might be thinking, okay, Diana, this is like interesting information and all, but isn't this just because like, well, if you go through bad things in life, in childhood, then you're gonna grow up to, do things that are bad for you. Like maybe if you have a smoker in the family, then you're gonna grow up and smoke yourself, and then that's gonna increase your risk of these things. Well, part of it is that, but actually these statistics stay true regardless of your likelihood to conduct bad behavior. AKA, you can live everything perfectly. You can do everything the right way, stay healthy with your choices. And yet, if you have these ACE numbers, your biology, your neurology are fundamentally changed to the point where you have these increased risks of disorders, even if you do everything the right way. Think of it this way. Our body's fight or flight response is supposed to be adaptive to stress, right? Like we see that there's a stressful situation happening, and to save ourselves, we react in that fight or flight sense. But when you activate that system every single day, that adaptive system becomes maladaptive. And children are especially sensitive to this. It starts affecting your immune system development, etc., and ends up changing your entire body stress system. So ACEs matter a lot because they can fundamentally change the way that we are able to cope with trauma and with distress, and then also with even practices of healing. And yet we don't necessarily think about them that much. So at this point, you might be thinking, okay, now that I have some ideas of what may cause a mental illness, what exactly is mental illness? Here are a list of mental illnesses that are pretty common, quote unquote. Some of these are not necessarily categorized as mental illness by some definitions, but I'm including them here for general purpose and education. I want to do a quick little exercise with you all. So first, I want you to go down this list and make a mental note, or jot it down on a piece of paper somewhere. How many of these you think you have a pretty good understanding about? Like if someone asked you about them, you'd be like, yeah, I think I know what that entails, what that means, or what someone with that disorder might do. Anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, OCD, bipolar, PTSD, psychotic disorders, personality disorders, ADHD, eating disorders. Cool. So once you have that count made, I want you to go through this list again. But this time, I want you to only count the disorders where you have been specifically educated in the symptoms, in the causes, in the potential treatment methods, etc., of that disorder, and you've been educated in that by somebody who has lived experience, by somebody who is a professional in the mental health field, by a textbook or like a credible online resource, or you have had personal experience with it. So the reason why I asked you to do this is because you can't see this right now through the screen, but when I do this workshop in person, what happens every single time is that the first run, where I just ask people, raise your hand if you have an idea of what this disorder entails, or you think you know what it entails. Most people raise their hands for most of them. But when we get to that second round, the number of hands raised drop significantly. And what this shows is not any fault of your own, by the way. It's just a ramification of the media and the internet culture where we spread these buzzwords around, but we don't actually take the time to fully understand what those buzzwords entail. So then, what does that mean? Well, part of what makes this difficult is going to be answered in some other myths that we're about to bust. So let's debunk. What is true? Well, what is true is that people with severe mental illnesses are over 10 times more likely to be victims of violent crimes in the general population. This is very important because a lot of times people think that, oh, I'm scared of people with mental illnesses because those people are probably violent or crazy or whatever else, but actually people with mental illnesses are going to be more likely to be victims than you are. Culture, family background, religion, and other factors that make up our story can impact our understanding of mental health. Youth are especially vulnerable to mental illness, especially today. Suicide has increased by over 60% in the past 45 years. And then, you have the whole social media factor, people being like, oh, social media is linked to increasing depression, in mental health disorders, in FOMO or fear of missing out, which to an extent I think is a fair assessment to make. I mean, I've definitely had times when I'm scrolling through Instagram and I'm like, dang, I feel so bad about my life because I'm like seeing people like on vacation all the time or like looking like actually like physically impossible like, in their proportions. And like, that's like photo editing, but like when you're just scrolling through, you don't necessarily think about that. You're just like, wow, why am I like this? But that being said, I will say this, I don't think it's fair to blame everything on social media because partly it's also that whole thing I was talking about earlier with just people spreading these buzzwords around, but not actually knowing what they mean. So I think if we associate it with that spread of buzzword with an actual education in detail, then social media and media in general can actually be a really good informative and educational force. And so on that note, here are some false statements. I feel sad, moody, or burnt out, so I must be depressed. Let me go back. This is very much tied to that earlier exercise that we just did, where we tend to now over-pathologize. And what I mean is we see one symptom, and then we're like, wow, that means we must have this disease. It kind of reminds me of like when you go on the internet and you're like, wait, okay, my throat isn't feeling so well. What are some possible disorders that I have? And then WebMD is like, guess what? You have cancer. And you're like, oh my God, just like everything just is like, oh my God, you have cancer. You have cancer. So like, this is kind of like that, right? Like we don't necessarily really know what depression or what anxiety disorder, what bipolar disorder entail. So then we're like, well, I think this is one of those symptoms. So I must have this disease, right? And this is particularly dangerous because even though it can be like a very innocent thing, like we don't realize that we're like just, diagnosing ourselves, even though we don't necessarily know if we actually have that disease. What this does is that it, in a way, like over normalizes mental illness. I guess it's hard to say because like, on one hand, like I'm like, oh, I want to destigmatize mental illness. So you might be thinking, well, then why are you complaining about over normalization? But what I mean is like, mental illness should not be like a glorified thing, right? But like, it's not trendy to be mentally ill or whatever. It's not cool or fit or like hip for you to be just the right amount of crazy. And yet that seems to be a lot of the discourse that's going around, especially among young people these days. I hear those a lot. And then people who have a diagnosis from like a mental health professional sometimes feel like, oh, because now everybody is depressed, then for them to feel like their mental illness is taken seriously, they think they have to resort to more drastic means to show the seriousness of their mental illness. And so then they might resort to self-harm or even risk of suicide. And so this is actually a very dangerous thing. And I say this not to be like, hey, your feelings aren't valid, because that's not what I mean. Like, your feelings of stress, of sadness, of whatever else are completely valid and, worthy of support and deserving of empathy. Absolutely. What I mean is just I wish and I hope that we are a little bit more careful going forwards in the way that we describe the severity or like the medicational or like the scientific definition of how we're feeling. So another myth is that mental illness is a choice and that people who have a mental illness need to just get over it. As we saw earlier with like ACEs and also biological, sociocultural, and environmental factors, mental illness is not a choice. People with mental illness are dangerous or crazy. Well, let's look at the first bullet point under true. And it's clear that this is not the case. People with a mental illness are dependent upon others. I don't think that's true either. Like, yes, there are going to be times when someone with a severe mental illness may need to go to a specific treatment center or may need a caregiver in the family. But that's also true for a lot of physical illnesses. And I don't think that makes a person any less of a person. That doesn't make somebody any less deserving of being cared for. You wouldn't say that somebody who has lung cancer is a bad person because they're dependent on others or whatever. Like, it's not their fault that they have that illness. People with a mental illness have no friends. This is not true. Like, mental illness it's not a death sentence. I think people think that, oh, if you have a mental illness, then you're just gonna like be like a loner and like you can't socialize, you're just like messed up. But that's not true. Plenty of people with mental illness are able to have lots of friends. And one of the reasons behind that is kind of sad, where people feel like they have to hide their pain because they're scared of what people might say. And so they become, so that they outwardly show this very social, very happy personality. And they gain a lot of friends that way. But hopefully we can get to a point where this sort of myth is not true, so that people don't feel like they have to fake their way into retaining their friends. I hope people can feel like they can be honest with the way that they feel and seek support without thinking that they're going to risk losing the people around them. And finally, mental illness disables someone for life. This is not true. Plenty of people with mental illness are able to recover with proper treatment system. Yes, some mental illnesses do last for an entire lifetime, but a lot of people are able to find great ways to cope with that. And the right treatment plan can help people live very well, functional, and even happy lives. Oh, my bad. One more. Some ethnicities and races are more prone to mental illness than others. This is not true. Scientific studies generally show that no one race is more likely to have a mental illness than others. So, now that we are there, here's some ideas about symptoms of mental illness, because you might be thinking, well, if I want to know through a professional whether or not I have a mental illness, how do I know it's time to look for help, right? Like, that's when you look for symptoms. And you might have heard of this concept of the love languages. There are 5 love languages: acts of kindness, words of affirmation, touch, etc., etc. But just as it is important for us to ask what our and each other's love languages are, it's also important to ask those questions about our pain languages. So at Letters to Strangers, we have a special acronym that we've created to talk about our pain languages, empathizing. So the first letter is E. E for eat. Eat too much, eat too little, that's a sign. That could be a sign of stress, etc. M for mind distractions. Could be personal, it could be social. So like personal could be like cleaning or gaming too much. Social could just be trying to dissolve yourself in a crowd of people at a party or something. P is for pride. So like the ego might become especially sensitive during this time. You might be in denial of certain things that could offend that ego, or maybe we're like seeking for extra validation, affirmation for our pride. A is for anger. T is for tears. H is for hurting the self, whether that's like verbally or physically. I is for insomnia or hypersomnia, sleeping too little, sleeping too much. Z is for zany. So when I say zany, like I don't just mean like humor. Like I don't mean that someone's just trying to be funny. It's almost like you're adopting a character, like a facade. You're putting yourself into this role of somebody else who isn't feeling that pain that you are, who is funny, who is lovable, who is just quirky. It's a way of disguising your pain by adopting another personality, basically. And actually, part of the way that we do this a little bit in this modern age is a very subtle way, but it's the use of emojis. Many times when we are talking to our friends and like we might not be feeling so well, if they ask like, "Oh, how are you doing?" Like we're gonna be like, just like dying, LOL, and then like laughing, like crying face emoji, whatever else. And then they're like, "Oh, haha, yeah, same." And then like they like have like the skull emoji and then another like laughing, crying face emoji. Um, a lot of times, like we use these emojis almost like a safety net. Like, hey, I want to tell you that I'm like suffering, man, but like I'm scared of what you all say. So I'm putting these emojis there so that you can choose to interpret what I said as a joke if it makes you uncomfortable. And then that way we can pretend like nothing like bad happened and we can just continue having this conversation as we usually do. So when you see that people are using a lot of emojis in this way, like whether that's yourself or somebody around you, that could be a sign that you're trying to adopt another personality that like is happier, is not feeling the pain that you actually are, etc. I is for imprudent behavior, so being really reckless, like drinking too much or like gambling a lot. N is for not present, so that could be like silence, like you're just verbally not present. Could be absence, like you're physically not present, or it could be drifting. So like let's say you're like present at like a friend's like gathering, but like your mind is drifting all over the place. And then lastly, G for gross productivity. And what I mean by that is like overworking. I think a lot of us tend to fall into this trap where we think, oh, if I'm not working myself to the point where I'm overly stressed and tired, then I'm not doing enough. And then therefore I am not valuable. And so I must overwork to achieve a sense of self-worth. And while that can be a great motivator to get a lot of things done, I think a lot of us also recognize that like it's fundamentally not a healthy mindset, right? Like hopefully you will be doing things while being able to engage your body in an efficient, healthy, and clear manner rather than like a very sort of state. So any one of these bullet points, like in and out of itself, doesn't necessarily mean much. But it's like when you notice there are changes in these, or like they are expressed in combinations with each other, they're getting more severe over time. That's when you know that these are symptoms of pain. But with all that said, it's not like this whole discussion is just about sad things or bad things. There's also plenty of protective factors involved. And these are great, great, great resources for us to not only get better if we have a mental health crisis, but also just to maintain our mental well-being. The preventative screening, like, you get, you might get annual doctor checkups for like your physical health. You might as well just do preventative screenings for mental health also. Like that could look like asking yourself questions about like if you've had any ACEs, or going to like see a therapist like once a year just to like check in with how you're feeling. Catch things before they happen so that you don't get to a point where you're in a crisis and you're like, oh no, I don't know what to do, right? It's much easier to act on well-being when you are clear-headed than when you're like in a very distressed state. Family and community, access and participation in fun and recreational activities, access to ongoing effective care, restricted access to means of harm. So like if you have like a firearm in your house, lock that up. Skills in conflict resolution, problem solving, and nonviolent handling of disputes, learning to feel good about your own actions in the face of danger. Sometimes like if you're like in a dangerous situation, like let's say somebody is in a situation of assault, that person might blame them for like taking actions like running away or like, fighting back. Like that person, that the victim might feel very bad about taking those actions, like thinking, oh, I should have done this, or like, oh, I wish I like stood up more. But like, you know what? Screw it. You were in danger. Like, just be proud of the fact that you were able to even, survive the situation. And even if you didn't do things perfectly, that doesn't mean that you're a bad person. Doesn't mean that you deserve that situation. Um, Cultural and religious beliefs that discourage suicide, practicing your strengths. And when I say strengths, I don't mean like lifting or like I could mean lifting, but like also when I say practicing strengths, like if you know that you are a very honest person, making a point to really utilize that honesty in a healing way, at least once a day, can actually help you remind yourself of your own worth. So like if your friend is feeling very sad, and if you're very honest with them about how you feel about them, how much you care about them, like that's gonna mean a lot to them because they know they can trust you because they know you are an honest person. Things like that. Meditation or yoga. Preventative safety measures are also really great. Like they allow you to be able to act and respond effectively in a time of crisis when you otherwise might not be thinking clearly. So like make a safety plan. And on that safety plan, you can write down things like things you can do for yourself when you're going through a crisis, people you can reach out to who are not professionals, and places you can go to decompress. Mental health professionals, names or numbers, addresses, hotline numbers, etc. You can put these in your phone. Actually, please do put these in your phone. Everybody carries their phones around these days. I think that's going to be the best thing you can do for yourself preemptively. Another thing is, I didn't put this on the slide, but there are also things called warm lines. And warm lines are like hotlines, except for people who are not going through a mental health crisis, but rather are just going through difficult feelings and would like somebody to talk to. So those are great options, especially if you're not like at immediate risk of harm. And if you're like, well, I don't think I can call these people because I'm not in this country or I don't have a good phone plan. A lot of these services offer online like chats as well. So that could be a great information, a great source to write down on your card, on your plan. So then let's look at coping skills and self-care. This is probably something that you're very excited for because I know that self-care is talked about all the time. But I'm not interested here to tell you about like the stuff that you already know, like hydration, sleeping well, eating well. It's so obvious. So like you've heard it before. So I'm going to tell you some other things that I hope are very practical. So like positivity portfolio. What I mean by that is like creating like a binder. It could be like digital, it could be physical, but just like creating binder for different emotions, and then use those to collect letters, pictures, videos, song lyrics, Bible verses, etc. Drawings. Use those to create portfolios around emotions like joy, gratitude, serenity, and calm, interest, hope, pride, amusement, inspiration, awe, and love. And then these are going to be a great way for you to reflect on what you do have in your life and also give you a reminder of why your life is worth living when you might be going through a crisis. A gratitude journal is another great thing to do, writing down each day what you're grateful for. It could be very simple. It can take you like 30 seconds, honestly. Writing letters. Letters to strangers believes greatly in the healing power of writing letters. You write to a stranger, you know that they're not going to judge you, you know that you can trust them to actually care about what you have to say, and hopefully that allows you to feel less alone. There's healthy, productive distractions like art/music or like your pets. These are, when I say healthy, I'm talking about like in respect to alternatives like doing drugs or whatever else. Focusing. So a lot of times people will say, oh, you should like practice on focusing your mental, like, I don't know, like just like mentally be more aware, basically, right? But what does that mean? So what I mean, and some specific tips I'll tell you are around concepts like sub-vocalization. So sub-vocalization is what happens when like, you know how when you are reading something and as your eyes are scanning the words, sometimes like your brain, inside your brain, you're like reading those words out loud. That's sub-vocalization. So being aware of your sub-vocalization is a great way to focus your mind. Deep, slow breathing. There's something called box breathe, where you can. I like to do this around like an object near me. Just find anything that's like shaped like a box. It helps you like focus. And then as you go up one edge, you're breathing in. You hold that breath. You breathe out. You hold. You breathe in. Hold out. Hold. You do this to a steady rhythm, and because you're tracing a box, it's like very easy for you to maintain that rhythm. And that's a great way to practice slow breathing, even if you're out in public and like having a crisis. Rational responding, so just like asking yourself if like this is a rational response. Schema work. Schema is a system of like thinking and processing information that oftentimes gets built up and constructed during our childhood. And they inform the way that we react to things and we process emotions. So, for example, let's say that you're sitting in a coffee shop and then somebody walks over and then knocks over your coffee cup. Now, a person who went through a lot of childhood bullying might have a schema where they interpret that action as a sign that this person hates them or thinks that they're a bad person. Whereas someone with a healthier schema will just look at this situation and be like, well, clearly this was just an accident. Like this person just like unintentionally knocked over my coffee cup. It's fine, like whatever, I'll move on with my day. So schema work is important because when you are able to recognize your own schemas, that helps you with noticing if the way that you're responding to a situation is rational, or if it's a result of a schema that may be misguided. Metacognitive stuff, so like working on acceptance and compassion for others, but also for yourself. Breaking down large tasks into small ones can really help with feelings of overwhelmness. And then last but not least, an emotional glossary. So what I mean is when we are not feeling so well, we might just say things like, oh, I'm feeling sad, or I'm feeling angry, or I'm feeling annoyed. But try to hone in on those words a little bit more. Work on the nuances of the way that you express your emotions. That can be a great way to communicate your needs better to other people, well, but also for you to better understand what you're going through, so that you can heal in a more specific and efficient way. So, like, rather than like I'm angry, you could be like I feel betrayed. Rather than I'm sad, you can say I'm grieving. You know, there are different levels to the way that we express our emotions. And then there's plenty of like treatment options. That being said, treatment options will differ depending on your local environment, especially because a lot of Western psychotherapy practices are not necessarily common in other countries. So take what I say in this slide with a grain of salt, but there's, non-healthcare professionals like friends, family, self-care methods. Also, religious officials can go in here to traditional healers. Psychotherapy or teletherapy, different types of therapy are offered for different types of disorders. So if one type of therapy doesn't work for you, maybe you want to try another type. Like, just to give you a quick example, cognitive behavioral therapy is like one of the most popular known types of therapy. But it really focuses on like the present, and it's like almost like workshopping the way that you think. But if you want to, look more into how your past or maybe repressed memories have affected your current mental health, then psychodynamics therapy may be a better choice for you. So things like that. And then there's medication or hospitalization. So for example, a common type of antidepressant is SSRIs. And the thing with medication, like a lot of people are afraid of taking medication because they're like, oh, well, I'm like fundamentally changing myself. But the thing is, like, when you have a cold, you are also taking like medication probably, or like you will have to take medication at some point in your life for some physical illness or the other. So think of it like this is the same thing, right? Like there are side effects, yes, but what medication doesn't have side effects? And secondly, if it's at a point where you're weighing, the benefits versus like, the potential side effects, like learn all the information you can about both sides and then make an informed decision. If you don't want to take it, like that's totally up to you. But at the end of the day, I recommend not just dismissing it outright because, oh, I don't believe in medication. Because sometimes there are situations where medication can be a great way to help, even if that's not always true. I will say this about medication, though, especially if you are taking traditional types of medication, like herbal medicine or something else. Sometimes they can have dangerous side effects when taken in conjunction with a Western psychiatric medication. So make sure that you tell both like a traditional healer that you're working with and the Western doctor that you're working with what you're taking so that they can be sure that you're not going to have any bad drug interactions. And then another thing I want to talk about is how culture, immigration, and stigma can be big influences in our perception of mental health. So these are some of the things that can affect our mental health. I think it's pretty straightforward, so I'll move on from this pretty quickly. But just know that like nuances of these categories can affect the person's mental health in a way that those of us outside of that category may not be able to understand right away. Like for example, people with certain diets, like there's been a lot of studies that show how nutrition has a very clear link to mental well-being. So your diet might actually make you more likely to be prone to mental illness due to the fact that you might be eating things that are not that healthy for you. And so that's one of the situations where when you don't necessarily know what is going on with somebody else's mental well-being or mental illness, looking to the aspects of their identity that might be affecting their manifestation could be a great way to get started. And then what are some of the possible reasons why people don't necessarily seek professional help? Well, it's a white person thing. That's probably something that a lot of you have heard. There's that fear of gossip, like it's a question of family honor. Men don't cry, respect the family, betrayal of faith. Like, hey, you should just go pray. Like, if you are really that faithful in God, then you should not be experienced as mental illness, etc. There's accusations of ungratefulness, especially among like immigrant families. Like, hey, I sacrificed so much for you, and you having this mental illness is a sign of you being ungrateful. Or sometimes people are just they just are uneducated in what mental illness means. So all of these are possible reasons why someone might not want to seek professional help because they're afraid of this sort of response. And so keep that in mind also, because I know sometimes it can feel frustrating when you're trying to help somebody with a mental illness and you say like, hey, I think you should go seek some help. And they're like, well, I don't think I can seek help. And then you might feel frustrated with them. But consider the nuances behind that there. So as we're getting close to the end, and also just a quick note here, there was a little bit of confusion earlier about the timing of this webinar. So sorry if like you're coming in now and it's like we're getting towards the end. This is all going to be online later, so I hope it's not too bad. We're also going to have a Q&A session at the end, so if you have any questions, even if we addressed it earlier on in the webinar, I'm happy to repeat that information in case you missed it earlier. So what can we do? No one walks this earth alone. This is a phrase, a mantra almost, that I really believe in. So to begin, I want to talk about some general tips. First is to watch your language. So we're moving away now as a society from the phrase committed suicide to died by suicide. And the reason why is because the word committed kind of has like a criminal connotation to it. Like, oh, this person committed a crime, right? Or this person committed a felony. But suicide is not a crime. So we want to make it more human. Think of it also like the case if someone has a physical illness, like you wouldn't say, oh, this person died by cancer. Oh, sorry, you wouldn't say this person committed cancer. You would say they died by cancer. And then the same thing when you are talking about someone who has completed suicide, better to say completed rather than succeeded in. You want to say people with mental illness or with bipolar disorder. You don't want to say mentally ill people or bipolar people because, being like having someone having a mental illness does not mean that like your personality is now like mentally ill. You know, like it's an adjective. If you use it as an adjective, then it's like you're describing the person as that thing. Whereas if you're talking about people with this, then it's more human and recognizing that they are a lot more than just their mental illness. You want to avoid trivialization or unnecessarily pathologizing mental illness. This basically goes back to what I was talking about earlier with the whole thing about you don't want to get to a point where because people around you are not necessarily aware of the nuances of mental illness, then like you just think, oh, because I'm sad, I must be depressed. Like you don't want to overly pathologize any specific symptom. And at the same time, you want to avoid sensationalizing or unnecessarily mentioning names. So like if you're going to be talking about a friend who passed away due to suicide, it's best to not try to ask about those means. It's best not to even mention the means of suicide because a lot of times that can be taken as inspiration for other people and it's just not a good idea. So at the same time, then you want to avoid glamorization or idolization of those who pass from suicide. Sometimes people consider suicide because they think it's like the one way for them to still have like some sort of meaning in the world. Like they think, oh, well, if I pass away, then people will actually care about me and then they'll like look at me like a martyr or something, even though right now they hate me. And so if you idolize or glamorize people who pass by suicide, you could be feeding onto that sort of fantasy that a person who is considering suicide might have. So you want to avoid that. So yeah, watch your reporting ethics. You know, do not publicize the method. Otherwise, it could lead to copycat suicides. So when you talk about the stressful event with someone, you know, ask not just what happened, but also what happened leading up to it and the person's thoughts for possible ways to address the situation. Ask them how they think you would feel about their potential solutions and what would happen if that approach was followed and how they think you would approach the situation. Basically, like I'm just giving you an example here of like almost like a template that you can follow as you're talking to somebody. Because the more you can understand like the nuances surround the context surrounding the situation, but also the more that you phrase things in a question-like manner to make them feel like they're the ones who are being heard, the more you can better help them. Take them seriously. If you're thinking that they might be suicidal, then they probably already thought about it. You can't make someone suicidal just by asking them. So don't be afraid of that. And let them help you. I interviewed a bunch of people in San Francisco a few years ago. And one guy I talked to, he had been homeless in the streets of downtown Berkeley for 17 years. His name is Michael. And Michael said to me, I just want to be well enough to help somebody else. That was really meaningful to me. You know, it's this idea that if you are mentally healthy, that you are at a point in your life where your bucket is filled enough that you can give some of what you have to other people. So if you want to help somebody, let them help you. Give them that agency back. Show them, tell them that you believe in the fact that they have a bucket that is more than that is not empty. You know, so give them that opportunity to express their humanity, their agency. And so before I leave, the last thing I will share with you is a method that we have created here at Letters to Strangers. It's an acronym called SIMPLE, and it stands for self-advocate, increment, meditate, patience, listen, and educate. And hopefully it can be interpreted to both be useful for yourself and also for others. So self-advocate. How do you talk to those who might not believe you when you say that you have a mental illness or that your mental illness is serious? Well, first of all, be honest. Second, do your research so that if they ask you questions, you can back your answers up. Be prepared for what they might say. It's not pretty. It might be hurtful to even think about. It might scare you. But preparation is going to help you when you're faced with a sudden question, right? Reassure them that you're not disagreeing with their point of view, but that your own experience is leading you to a new conclusion. This is especially important for when you're talking with parents who might come from more traditional beliefs about mental health. Because if you're like, well, you're wrong, that's not going to go anywhere, right? It's the clash is just going to make the whole conversation become a moot point. Show your emotions, be human. Sometimes I've talked to parents in workshops who are like, I didn't believe in mental health, but then I saw my child like and how like badly like she was crying, and I was just like, wow, she's really hurting. I want to help her. So don't be afraid to show your emotions. Ask questions. Like sometimes they might not respond well if they think that like you're just like giving them a monologue, lecturing to them or whatever. So if you ask them questions, they might feel a little bit better about the conversation. Remember, this is not a zero-sum game. You're not in it to win the discussion about who is right about mental health or whatever else. You're in it to accept yourself. Being a self-advocate means knowing your own limits too. So if you need rest, don't be afraid to do so. And if something makes you uncomfortable, say so. Next, increment. So take things one step at a time. Understand that sometimes, you can take 2 steps forward and then it ends up feeling like 4 steps back, but that's okay. The overall trend is still upwards. Make bite-sized, achievable action items. This ties into what I said earlier about breaking large tasks down into smaller tasks. Reach the topic gently, incrementally, and then ease into it. Right? So if you're talking to somebody about mental health, you might be scared about how to bring up that conversation. So you can be gentle with it. That being said, as you increment yourself into that conversation, do be direct when you ask about if they might be considering suicide or whatever else. Because if you say something like, oh, have you been thinking of hurting yourself? Well, this person might view suicide as the opposite of hurting themselves because they might feel like they are in so much pain right now that suicide is the only way for them to leave that place of hurt. And so when you are trying to dodge the question, you might not get the answer that you need to get. So be direct about it, but you can be direct in a gentle way, right? Remember, you cannot make someone suicidal simply by asking, so don't be afraid about that. It's easy to rush into solutions and what ifs, but increment instead. Take things step by step. And that way, that'll also allow you to actually physically be there, right? Like instead of just saying, oh, you need to go seek help. And maybe like, hey, first, let's look up some therapists around you and you can be there with that person as they do that. Remember, at the end of the day, you're not fixing people's problems for them. You're helping them get to the point where they can solve it themselves. No one wants to be the broken person that needs to be fixed, okay? People are not inherently shattered pieces for us to place back together. There's no, you're not the knight in shining armor, they're not the damsel in distress. And that's actually a very good thing because that means you don't have to shoulder the burden of their mental illness on yourself. Remember that your role is to help guide them. It's not to do everything for them. Meditate. So when I say meditate, I don't just mean sitting in a lotus position and going which it's really great also, I do that too, but what I really mean is just being aware, reflecting critically, asking yourself the questions that I have on the slide here, discovering the quiet, locate the present. What are your sensations? Tune into your 5 senses. Let your thoughts flicker by. Pick them up, gently lay them down. Just hold them, observe them. Don't think about them. Just view those thoughts and then let them go. This moment of peace, paused in time, is a safe space that you can always return to. So once you are able to meditate to a point where you can capture that space and get to that space quickly, that can be a great way to find calm in a time of crisis. Patience. Do not judge, do not say that there's something wrong with them, ask them why they won't accept it, be gentle. What I mean here is the word anoxtosia. I still can't pronounce it right. But basically, this is a thing that I think most people get impatient about. It's when somebody directly rejects the idea that they have a mental illness, right? If you are trying to help somebody and they're like, well, no, I don't have a mental illness, that can feel really aggravating. But actually sometimes, so that is called anostogia. Sometimes that is a symptom of mental illness. Sometimes people's mental illnesses manifest in a way that makes them deliberately believe that they do not have a mental illness. It's kind of tricky to think about, right? But my point being is that in this case, don't judge. Just be gentle. Remember, do not lose the sight of who they are, what their humanity is. They are not some object that you're trying to get from point A to point B. They are a person. So rather than asking them questions like, why are you like this or whatever, which can sound very accusative, ask them questions that start with what? Like, what is going on in your head that makes you feel like this is the case? Remember that a lot of people, when they're going through a time of crisis, think non-linearly. So we might think, normally like, oh, I'm going to go from point A to point B. But a lot of times when you're going through a mental health crisis, your head is like if you think about this as like the road that we walk on, this road might like get twisted like this, so that you might so that what feels natural to you in that moment is going from like here to like here, but then from like a person who is not in that crisis mode, from their perspective, what it looks like is just like a twisted mess, right? So if you are trying to help somebody else and they're going through a crisis, and you're like, no, listen, you got to put things in this order, you might actually be hurting them even more, because in their head, everything is not necessarily linear. So when you try to force them to think about things in a linear way, it might just confuse them. So empathize, be aware of boundaries, wait, why am I talking? And that's what this stands for. Listen, really. Persist, and then know when you yourself need help also. Remember, self-care is important. Listen. So echo what they say. Oh, so this happened, right? Like, show them that you're listening. Ask them questions. Confirm their emotions. Like, oh, so it sounds to me like you're like really angry that this happened to you. And they might be like, oh, no, actually, I'm not angry. I'm just sad. Like you can better understand the situation when you ask these questions. Speaking the I. So when you want to give, if you want to give advice, which I don't think should be your primary goal at all. Remember, the primary goal is just to listen, give them that space to rant. Most of the time we feel better after we rant. It's not necessarily because we're asking somebody to solve the problem for us. We just want someone to listen. So if you do feel like you're at a point where actually they do want you to give advice, try to speak in the I. Like, I found that this works for me, rather than like, I know this is going to work for you, right? Because you don't necessarily know that. And then last but not least, educate. Know your resources, your definitions, your facts, your stereotypes, your assumptions, your identity. These are things that I've gone over in this workshop, so hopefully that was helpful and gets you a step in the right direction. The great thing about being educated is that even if you are doing it just for yourself, when other people around you see that you're this educated, they can feel more comfortable in coming up to you to talk about their own struggles, also because they know that you care. And that's a great way to show that you're someone who's willing to support other people and actually, like, meaningfully show that, rather than just saying it in a very blanket statement. So anyway, I hope that was helpful. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, let me know now. You can also learn more about how you can get involved with our organization by starting a chapter or doing other activities that we've created at letterstostrangers.org. We're going to be launching the world's first Youth for Youth mental health guidebook with a lot of this information and much, much more. It's going to be coming up at the end of the year, so please subscribe to our e-newsletter or follow our website or social media at L2S Mental Health to be notified when that goes live. And feel free to email me at Diana or hi@letterstostrangers.org. Awesome. Cool. So if you have any questions, you know how to reach me, you know how to find our information online. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. I hope you learned something useful. And yeah, have a great time moving forward from this with your mental well-being journey and that journey for others around you. You can do it. You're not alone. You're worthwhile. I believe in you.